I hope you're doing well. Before we get started with this video, I just want to say that the next episode of kind of my road to becoming a freelance photographer or starting a online photography business, whatever you want to call it, is coming out next Monday, so stay tuned for that. But in today's video, we are talking about kind of the holy trinity of photography and how you can actually get these sharp photos that you want to make. What is the holy trinity of photography, I hear you asking? Well, basically it's ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So in this video, I'm going to cover all three of these separately, and then towards the end of the video, I'm actually going to show you or share with you how to best manage all three of these at the same time. And on that note, if you are kind of familiar with any of these, feel free to jump to the timestamps down below and just skip ahead in the video. Okay, but now you might be asking, who is this person? Why should I kind of listen to you? And I totally get that. So hi, my name is Sophie, and I want to help you actually make money with photography or start your own online photography business slash take your photography to the next level. And the reason why you should trust me, or I am kind of in a position to share information with you, is because I'm going through this journey myself right now. Unlike a lot of those other bigger people on YouTube, I know what you're looking for. I know the information that you might need right now because I was in the same position as you very recently. And so yeah, I want to share all of my advice with you so that you don't make the same mistakes that I did, because I actually want you to succeed. And I think you probably know, or it's quite obvious, that content is quite important for any kind of business. So, or whatever it is that you want to do, content is kind of key. So I want you to kind of create the best content that you can create. And what's really important in order to do that is to really nail down these three basics of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed to again create the best pictures that you can. So leave a like down below at any point in time if you do find this video helpful, and also don't forget to subscribe. Okay, so let's actually start off with the first of these three. Let's start talking about ISO, and I hope at this point you guys can actually see my iPad. So let's start off with ISO. So what actually is ISO? You can think of ISO kind of like a fake light, okay? So I forgot the T there, like fake light. So what do I mean by that? Basically, if you are in a situation where you don't have a lot of light on your subject, it's quite dark, you can increase your ISO to add more light. So if you kind of make this higher, you get more light, okay? That makes sense. And on the other hand, if you have a well-lit subject, if you lower your ISO, you're gonna get less of that kind of fake light, okay? So ISO is just fake light. And on this note, if you have a well-lit situation, you do actually want to decrease your ISO, because in fact, if your ISO is too high, this even applies in low light conditions, just in general, if your ISO is too high, that can actually lead to what's called grain, or basically it's gonna make your image less sharp or blurry, which is not what we want. We wanna avoid that. We wanna create nice and crisp images. Okay, so that's basically all you have to know about ISO. Now let's move on to shutter speed. So what actually is shutter speed? Shutter speed is basically how long your shutter stays open. I'm just gonna put stays open here. So it's how long your shutter stays open, and naturally, the longer your shutter stays open, the more light you're actually going to get into your shutter. And on the contrary, the shorter your shutter stays open, the less light is going to get into your shutter. Okay, so shutter speed is actually measured in parts of seconds. So a long shutter speed could be something like 1/10th of a second, for example, whereas a short or a fast shutter speed could be something like 1/100th. Not 1,000th. Oh my god, that is very, very fast. No, 1/100th of a second, for example. And basically what that means is if you have a long shutter speed, like 1/110th, for example, you're gonna have a lot of light in your image. But more importantly, anything that happens in or during the time that your shutter is open will be reflected on the image, and that is very important to remember, because that means that if you're taking a picture of something that is in motion, you actually want to you actually want to have a high shutter speed, okay? Because you don't want that shutter to stay open very long. Otherwise, you're gonna see that motion in your picture, and you're gonna get what's called motion blur. On the other hand, if there is no motion, you can use a low shutter speed if you want to, and your image is still going to look nice and crisp. If there is motion in your kind of subject, you can also use a low shutter speed in order to get motion blur on purpose and get these really nice flowy waterfall shots, for example, or these really awesome long exposure shots of like car lights on the highway or something. Those are also really sick, but like in general, this is kind of what you want to stick to. And like I said, I did mention that shutter speed does affect kind of the lighting conditions as well. So how that ties in with ISO and also aperture, that's exactly what I'll get to towards the end of the video. Okay, so lastly, let's actually move on to aperture. I think I spelled that right. Okay, so what is aperture? Aperture is basically your depth of field. So what do I mean by that? Basically what depth of field means is how much of your image is in focus. So if you have a shallow depth of field, that means that only very little of your image is going to be in focus. So I'm just gonna put little focus here. I'll get to why you might want that in just a second. On the other hand, if you have a deep depth of field, that means you're gonna have more focus. Okay, so why would you kind of want a shallow depth of field? Well, imagine you're shooting a portrait of someone and the background is kind of a busy cityscape or a forest. You really only want their face to be in focus. You want them to stand out. And that's kind of where using a shallow depth of field is going to be useful. On the other hand, if you're shooting a landscape, for example, you want the entire scene to be in focus, so you want to use a deep depth of field. So here, aperture is actually measured in what's called f-stop, or you can also write it like this, but that is beyond the point. Basically what f-stop means is if you have a shallow depth of field, that corresponds to, or actually let's start with the deep one, it's going to be easier to draw. If you have a deep depth of field, that means that you actually have a high f-stop, like for example 22. On the other hand, if you have a shallow depth of field, that means you're going to have a low f-stop, like for example 1.8. And here again, the aperture does also affect how much light goes into your lens. By actually having a shallow depth of field, more light goes into your lens, and if you have a deep depth of field, less light is going to get into your lens, making the whole scene look darker. Okay, so now that we actually have our magical triangle looking pretty good, how do we actually use this? Well, what you want to do is, if you're about to take a photo, you want to think about what's the most important aspect of your photo. So let's say you're working in low light conditions. You might start with actually increasing your ISO. So now you're adding some of that artificial light, and naturally your subject is going to be better lit. In order to counteract that, what you can do is you can either increase your aperture just like an f-stop like 22 or 8, for example, or you can counteract your increase in ISO by actually increasing your shutter speed to something like 1/100, for example. And the reason why you want to counteract your increase in ISO is because that lets in more light, and then if you, instead of increasing your aperture to like f22, you were to decrease it to 1.8, you're going to be letting in even more light, and that's going to add to just way too much light and just kind of overdone highlights in your shot. So you want to balance this out. Now let's say you're in a situation that is well lit, but you want to take a photo of a subject that is actually in motion. So like we said before, you're going to increase your shutter speed, and in order to counteract that, because now you have less light actually coming in, you can either increase your ISO as well, or you can actually decrease your aperture or your f-stop to something like 1.8. Now, the third scenario here is, let's say your subject is well lit and it's not in motion, but you want to take a portrait and you really only want the face to be in focus. You want a shallow depth of field. What you can do is you can decrease your aperture to something like 1.8. That's going to let in a lot of light, so you can counteract that by decreasing your ISO or by actually increasing your shutter speed. So that's kind of how this works. You want to look at the scene that you're shooting and what's the most important factor of that scene, and then base your whole calibration around that. Okay, so that's it. That's all you will ever have to know about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture in order to create the sharp images that you want to create and actually take your photography to the next level. Like I said, I really want to create these videos to help you out, and so leave any questions that you have remaining in the comments down below, as well as any video suggestions that you have. And while you're down there, hit the thumbs up button. That would really help me out with the algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe, and on that note, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.